Hello, everyone, and welcome to this morning or this afternoon or this evening's webinar, depending on where you are, Defending Rights and Civic Space during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Stacey Cram. I'm Namati's Policy Director, and on behalf of the Legal Empowerment Network, Civicus, and the Justice for All campaign, I welcome you all to this virtual roundtable discussion on how grassroots justice groups respond to the challenges of constricting civic space and increasing human rights violations during this pandemic. Before we start, I just want to have a few reminders. Please note that the event is being recorded and we'll share the full recording and highlights later on our website. We'll try to keep the roundtable discussion to around 1 hour, and after that we'll have about 30 minutes for questions or comments from attendees. You'll see a questions panel where you can type your questions or comments and communicate with us directly during the webinar. And there's also a button for raising your hand to get our attention. So feel free to try it and feel free to use that throughout the course of the webinar. So the topic of this webinar was decided many weeks ago, but it would be remiss of us if we were not also to speak to the events that have occurred in the US and around the world since the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minnesota. So I'd just like to invite Vivek Maru to make some remarks in solidarity with those who are protesting and standing against police brutality and racial injustice. So Vivek, are you there?
Okay. Yes.
Hi, Vivek.
Hey, you can hear me, Stacey?
Yes.
Namaste, everybody. Yeah, Namati and the Legal Empowerment Network stand in solidarity with those courageously rising up across the United States and around the world against police brutality and systemic racism. Some of our network members here in the United States have been offering legal support to the protesters, and some of us have been taking part in the protests ourselves. We do encourage network members who are taking part in protests on this issue or on any other issue to abide by social distancing measures because we want to avoid further endangering ourselves or our communities. I personally live in Washington, D.C., and joining the protests with my family here over the last week, I have found myself weeping at times. This country, the United States, it's broken. There is injustice and inequality deep in its DNA. And that is true of our whole world in some ways. And living in these conditions, we, the people, are broken too. But the message of the protests is we may be broken, but we will not lay down. We will make this world anew. And that determination, that part of the human spirit that insists on justice no matter what, it's beautiful. I hope all of us can hold on to it in these challenging times.
Thank you, Vivek. And of course, we may come back to that in the discussion phase today, but we did have this all organized beforehand. So we have wonderful speakers to talk about some other terrible things that are currently happening around the world, unfortunately. So as countries are responding to this pandemic, governments we're seeing are asking for more powers and for more funds. They're tightening restrictions, not only on the freedom of movement part around the health pandemic, but also on freedom of information and freedom of expression. The security sector, police and military are increasingly engaged in the enforcement of lockdowns and quarantines and other government actions to better and less better ways. So in this webinar, we're going to explore ways in which legal empowerment groups can contribute to a just response to the COVID-19 pandemic, how they can protect their people and communities and push back against rights violations and policies that further constrict civic space. To lead today's discussion, you can see everyone's video. We have gathered esteemed network members from across the globe and on different issue areas. So I'm just going to start by introducing everyone and ask each of you to give a quick update on the situation in your country before we get into the kind of main discussion. So I'll start with Stefania Kapranetsky. Stefania is the Executive Director of the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union since July 2013. She started working at the HCLU in 2005 and was then the head of patients' rights from March 2008 till 2012. And as program director, Stefania has led HCLU's efforts to stop restrictions on reproductive rights. Hi, Stefania. Can you please give us a very brief description of Hungary in the current crisis?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So in Hungary, the lockdown measures are mainly lifted now. Only mass events are prohibited, and demonstrations are also prohibited to attend still. There were around 4,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the country, and around 600 of them resulted in death. So that's the situation right now. We are still under special legal order, but I will address that in my presentation.
Thank you, Stefania. From Europe, we're now going to go to Asia. I'm going to introduce Ritzli Santos. Ritzli is a social activist and human rights defender, and he's currently the executive director of Bali Alternative Legal Advocates for Development in Mindanao. Balaod, Mindanao, is a legal resource institution based in Cagayan de Oro City in the Philippines, working with poor marginalized sectors, identities, and local communities, particularly in the southern part of the country in Mindanao. He's also the chair of the Alternative Law Group, ALG, which is a coalition of legal empowerment organizations in the Philippines. And he is also a member of the International Board of Amnesty International. So hi, Ritzli, could you please share about the Philippines' current general situation?
Hello, everyone, and good evening on my side of the globe. Yes, I am Ritzli Santos III from Balao, Mindanao, Philippines. Currently, there are at least 23,700 cases of COVID, with 1,027 deaths and 4,895 recovered. Generally, we are under modified community quarantine, particularly in metropolitan area, with some restrictions on mobility, and demonstrations are likewise restricted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritzli. From Asia, we're now going to go to Latin America. I'd like to introduce Denise Dora. Denise is a lawyer and human rights activist with more than 25 years of experience in the areas of gender and access to justice. She's a founding member of Themis, Gender Justice and Human Rights, a feminist organization in Brazil that develops legal empowerment programs for women community leaders since 1993. Denise has worked for the Ford Foundation and for UN and served as an advisor to the Committee on UN Women in Brazil and Latin America and the Caribbean. She's currently a senior partner of Dora Azambuja and Oliveira, I've just made that terribly, apologies, a law firm specialized in civil society legislation, discrimination, and human rights. And she recently joined Article 19 as a director for South America. Hi, Denise. How are things in Brazil?
Hello, everybody. Nice to be with you. Things in Brazil are horrible. The curve of COVID-19 is just raising up. Numbers are really coming to 500,000 people who were contaminated by coronavirus, and more than 30,000 deaths. And the government is the federal government is a chaos. They have changed 3 times the Minister of Health and the whole staff of the health services. They are not providing any guidance. And at state and municipal level, people are doing different things. So some governments at local level are opening, some are closing. There are no clear directions. So, and in the middle of that, the wave of protests have started again in Brazil, and we see what's going on in this next weeks.
Thank you, Janice. Now we're going to take our discussions to Africa, to Kenya, where we have Julie Wayomatheka. Julie, sorry, I just did not double check your name before starting, but Julie has extensive knowledge in the judicial process with respect to upholding human rights. Currently, she leads the portfolio on criminal justice and security sector reform within the Human Rights and Justice Programme at the Kenyan section of the International Commission of Jurists, ICJ Kenya. ICJ is an organization dedicated to the promotion of human rights, justice, and democracy in Kenya and in Africa more broadly through the application of legal expertise and international best practice. Hi, Julie. Can you please give us a brief description of the current situation in Kenya right now?
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone in the respective places around the world. The Kenyan situation is quite interesting. We are in our third round of lockdown measures, and what has happened is that slowly but surely the government has considered easing the lockdown measures. So there's a lot of pressure on the president last week, actually, not to extend lockdown and to open up the economy. Unfortunately, that was not done. But what has happened, though, is that now we are under curfew from 9 p.m. to 4 a.m. daily. Our numbers currently are 2,898 persons tested positive. However, the persons who have been tested are around 100,000 in a population of 40 million. So our testing rate is not particularly high, and as such, we really do not know how many people have the virus in Kenya because of the low testing rates. So that is the situation in Kenya. As you can see, I am in the office, so slowly but surely, the economy is starting to open up again. Thank you.
That's great, Julie. Thank you. And last but not least, we're going to stay on the continent and move to David Cody. David is the advocacy and campaigns lead for Civicus. For over a decade, he's worked with civil society organizations around the world to strengthen their responses to human rights violations and civic space restriction. He's written extensively on civic space issues and how civil society can respond, and he regularly facilitates workshops on ways in which civil society can engage effectively with regional and international human rights mechanisms. David is going to share some very interesting reports that Civicus has put together on the state of civil society and on human rights violations carried out under the pretext of responding to the pandemic. But I'll let David start just sharing these recent reports from Civicus. And David, please feel free to give us some updates also from South Africa right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stacey. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I think the reports from South Africa are not really impressive. We have about, I think, close to 53,000 confirmed cases at the moment. That should be, I think, one of the highest in Africa. 29,000 have recovered, and then we have just over 1,000 deaths. At the start of somewhere in between the month of March, there was a shutdown imposed by the government under what the government called level 5. And now we are under level 3, which means some restrictions have been lifted. But you know, the economy is opening up gradually. We're still encouraged to work from home, except those who are doing essential services. But quite frankly, I wouldn't want to, I mean, I feel kind of sorry for the president at the moment, because whatever he does, he gets criticized and he gets pulled in different directions. We can't wait for this to end so that life can return to normal. I'll go straight away to my presentation. And if you can share the slides with me, I'd really appreciate it. Slide 2, please. Second slide. So I'll just provide some kind of a brief overview of civic space restrictions globally. I know colleagues here will speak about country-specific conditions, but prior to the shutdown, this is how the state of civic space across the globe looked like. And this comes from the Civicus Monitor. That is a tool we use to track civic space conditions in 175 countries around the world. And these are based on ratings. So for countries that are rated open, for example, we see this as countries where generally civic space restrictions are not put into effect, that where you have civil society and citizens who are able to effectively carry out the activities with minimal restrictions from the state. Then on the other hand, we have countries that are rated as closed, where civil society or citizens are not able to protest without violence from the state, where even speaking about human rights can lead to immediate arrest or death. So ahead of the shutdown, our analysis showed that just 3% of the population of the world live in countries that are rated open. About 40% of the world's population live in countries that are rated repressed. And repressed means civil society and citizens can voice views about issues affecting them or the state, but then you are sure to get restrictions or reprisals from the state. And 27% of the population of the world live in countries that are rated closed. Speaking about human rights can lead, like I said, to arrest or in certain cases death. Freedom of expression, assembly, and association almost completely restricted. And this was done prior to the shutdown, so late in 2019 and early 2020. But then we've been documenting civic space restrictions through the same monitor in different countries. And I'm sorry to say that the situation has not improved based on the fact that states have used the pandemic and the restrictions to further restrict human rights. The next slide, please. So we also broke down the restrictions into different categories. In other words, what are the 10 top restrictions across the globe? The first is censorship, either from journalists who speak out or report on issues, or citizens themselves who are able to talk about issues affecting them. So the top violation to civic freedoms is censorship. Then we have protest, the detention of protesters, especially given the fact that we had protests in almost every region of the world in 2019 towards the early part of 2020. The slide speaks for itself. I won't go through all the 10 restrictions because of time. But the first, like I said, is censorship. The ninth is excessive use of force, and the 10th is criminal defamation. The next slide, please. I'll be happy to share the slides in case you want to look at them deeply. So in the course of the COVID pandemic, we've monitored restrictions to civic space and fundamental freedoms. And like I said at the beginning, I'll speak from a global point of view because I know colleagues here will have specific country context. So based on our analysis, but also what we've picked up from research conducted by other organizations, in terms of restrictions on the media and freedom of expression, there are 335 restrictions that are directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And these restrictions include arrests and criminal investigations, restrictions on access to information, physical and verbal attacks against journalists, censorship on the media and journalists, and the promulgation of fake news in at least 16 countries. So in summary, as far as restrictions to freedom of expression are concerned, journalists have been arrested for simply reporting on specific cases, from Russia to Nigeria, to Cote d'Ivoire, to Benin. Journalists have been arrested for simply saying there's a case in this hospital, or the number of cases that the government reports is lower than what actually obtains in reality. We've also seen cases where journalists have been attacked from Liberia to Sierra Leone and other countries, and physically abused based on the fact that they were either covering a story about a particular quarantine site, or a protest related to some of the issues that citizens would like to raise as far as restrictions are concerned. Please move to the next slide. Other restrictions include arrest of human rights defenders who speak out about government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also seen cases where governments have used smear campaigns to delegitimize human rights defenders. And in some cases, we've seen actually the killing of human rights defenders, particularly those working in rural areas, as a strategy by the government to silence them. The next slide, please. We've seen brutal responses from the police during the lockdowns in these countries. And the sad reality is that when you look at the videos of these actions by police, you'd see that they largely target, those who are in the informal sector. And that's something that we really need to raise as far as the response to this pandemic is concerned. In Kenya and Uganda, for example, you see market women who would be going to the market because their daily subsistence based on what they sell, and this lockdown affects them to a very large degree. And then in South Africa, in certain townships, people have actually been killed based on the fact that they were chased from the streets into their homes because the police were trying to enforce the lockdown. Next slide, please. And then we've seen also laws and policies that violate the right to privacy of certain citizens. So security services or the government has used the phones of some people, had access to their communications in the name of or under the pretext that they want to get data on who exactly is affected by the pandemic, but they use that in a way to restrict fundamental freedoms. The last slide, I'm conscious of time. If you can go to the last slide, is just to provide a few recommendations, or just to highlight some of the ways in which civil society is pushing back against these restrictions, and I'll use a minute or two for that. The last slide, please. So civil society is pushing back as expected. And I think this crisis presents an opportunity for us to reimagine what civil society is, especially given the fact that we have a lot of smear campaigns and bashing of civil society, particularly those who are in organizations that focus on human rights, anti-corruption, and other issues affecting governance. We really need to amplify the role that civil society has played in this crisis. In Ethiopia, for example, a group of civil society organizations contributed funding from different sources and they are putting those that funding into a pot that the government has set up as a means to counter some of the threats that are posed by this pandemic. And you see a lot of actions across the world. Civil society going to the grassroots, going to rural communities, providing services that the government is either unable or unwilling to do that. And some of these positive narratives actually counter the negative trends and descriptions that the government has used to ascribe what the role of civil society is. We've also seen successful campaigns that have led to the release of human rights defenders and journalists. So as part of the response of states to this COVID pandemic, many countries have released thousands of prisoners so that they decongest jails. But then there's been campaigns that have forced some governments to include human rights defenders and journalists within this group of prisoners that have been released. It's not to the extent that we'd like to see. Just yesterday, we received, I think to me, what was the best news for me as an activist in 2020 in Bahrain, Nabil Rajab, who has been in jail, in and out of jail for close to 10 years, who was released and sent back to his family. We've also seen solidarity across civil society organizations in the global north and south. I'll end there. I'm conscious of time and would be happy to take questions at the end. Thank you so much, Stacey.
Thank you, David. And yes, that was great news yesterday. And I have been both dismayed and so impressed by the actions of what has happened to civil society and how they've still been able to respond during this crisis. We found that 91% of members surveyed in our Justice Challenge are still serving their communities right now, in spite of these lockdowns, in spite of everything that they're doing. And it's not just business as usual. They're delivering food aid, they're delivering health messages, and it's just the resiliency is overwhelming in spite of all of these ever challenging situations. So thank you for sharing that. And I think it provides a really excellent framework for a conversation as we turn to our other colleagues. So I'm now going to go back to Hungary. In March, the government gave vast emergency powers to the country's populist prime minister, Viktor Orban. The government has said that the emergency powers are necessary to fight the outbreak. Stephanie, can you just please share some experiences of how it has been under Orban during this pandemic, and tell us about how legal empowerment groups like the HCLU are responding to the challenges? Are we seeing governments taking advantage of the situation to get more power and to further construct civic space, and how does the government response affect freedom of expression and assembly of citizens in general and civil society in particular? Just start there, and anything else you would like to add, I'd love to hear.
Okay, and I try to keep it to 8 minutes. So good morning, evening, and afternoon, everyone again. So first, perhaps a couple of comments about the state of civic space in general in Hungary. We have two anti-NGO laws in place, and there is a very hostile rhetoric adopted by the government towards independent civil rights groups. They fall under, I guess, the smear campaign category that was presented by David so excellently. And I think it's also worth pointing out that the Hungarian government is extremely hostile towards anyone who is criticizing the government, be it from civil society or state institutions. So that eventually has a very serious diminishing effect on public discussion. And the pandemic just made it worse, as we have seen it in almost every country where there is an authoritarian government in power. So as you said, Stacey, we had a quite broad authorization act in place since March that gave the government the power to rule by decree without a sunset clause. Now there is a new act submitted to the parliament that will be voted on probably next week, and it's on the it's on terminating the state of danger, so terminating this special legal order. But we see it as not being able to terminate really this special legal order. We see it as a never-ending story. On the one hand, because it really unveils how the government is not serving the parliament, but the parliament is for the government, because the government asks the parliament to ask the government again to lift this state of danger. This is really tells a lot about the Hungarian rule of law and democracy. Secondly, the other problem with this new law, this termination of state of danger law, is that it broadens for the future that circle or scope of issues on which the government can rule by decree. So basically, this special legal order under the now to adopt rules will have no parliamentary oversight and no boundaries whatsoever. And on top of that, this new bill is proposing to introduce the little sister of the special legal order. It's the so-called state of medical emergency. That would also allow the government to rule by decree and restrict freedom of expression and freedom of assembly without even the facade of parliamentary oversight. And I want to highlight 3 issues in my presentation, 3 specific ones. One is about assembly and the freedom of expression, and then I will address a little bit the situation of civil society organizations under the pandemic. So, as I said previously, attending a protest is still prohibited by the special legal order regulations. Even though you can go into a restaurant and you can dine there, you are still prohibited to attend the protest. And there were regular protests despite the lockdown measures for weeks. People attended them through their car, so they were sitting in their car honking and thus sending a message. Or there were also people who were standing on the side of the road keeping the distance. Strictly speaking, of course, they were violating lockdown measures. However, in our opinion, the right to protest is, if practiced in compliance with safety measures, should be exempt from these lockdown measures, as it has been ruled by some constitutional courts around the world. And very high fines were imposed for the infringements of traffic regulations, as well as violating lockdown rules on these protesters. And the police was always present on these demonstrations. And eventually the protesters announced that because of these high fines, they cannot continue with the protesting. And this also has to be juxtaposed to the fact that there was also a demonstration in Budapest to commemorate 2 victims of a murder, which turned into a racist protest where speakers were calling for far-right forces to take actions and attendees chanting racist statements, and the police was idly watching it, and this was also happening during the period when protest is prohibited. The second thing that I want to mention is the new form of so-called scaremongering, which is only applied during a special legal order, and it's a new criminal provision. So when someone states or disseminates an untrue fact or a fact distorted in any way, which may hinder or foil the effectiveness of the state defense against the danger that caused the special legal order. So all these legalese really shows you how vague it is, this description, and how it can be easily misused by the police. And it was, at least in 2 cases, people who were sharing information on their social media, they were taken into police custody in the morning, and later they were released. But this already sends a really strong message to people who want to speak up, who want to disperse information, that the police may ring your bell in the morning and will take you into custody. And this has a very important chilling effect. Despite not being violent, as so many civil rights activists suffer from around the world, this is still a very strong message to anyone who would like to raise their voice. So I have met with various people after this took place, and everyone kept asking me, so if I share this on my Facebook, if I share that, then would I be committing a crime? And this brings me to my last point about civil society and what we are doing. The HCIU specifically, we really strengthened our legal aid service since the pandemic started. In a normal year, we respond to about 2,500, 3,000 legal requests. And since March until now, we responded over 2,000 legal requests only related to the coronavirus. So that's on top of the normal caseload. So that really shows you how much information is really needed by society. We also have a very small research about Hungarian civil society, which is not representative, but it also shows cases the experience of NGOs that have a significant past. So since the respondees, 80% of them have more than 10 years of existence. And 3/4 of the organizations reported about financial losses due to the crisis, due to suspended projects and lost donations. At the same time, about 60% of us reported that we were really quick and swift in adapting to remote working, and also reported about increased amount of work. 42% of the respondents retold their strategy, and about the same percentage also started to provide new type of activities in order to help people in the crisis. And that ranges from charity activities to the type of activities that I mentioned. And at the same time, it also has to be pointed out that civil organizations are completely left out from the government scheme to protect workplaces. So organizations are not eligible to apply for such support. So this is in short, and just showcasing 3 examples, but I'm happy to take questions. And I just want to draw your attention to one statement or one sentence that is expected next week. The first anti-NGO law that took place, that was adopted in 2017, is now up for review at the European Court of Justice, and they will deliver their sentence, their decision on June 18th. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you for all that you're doing in spite of these increasingly challenging situations. Big week next week for two pieces of information, so I hope at least one of them is positive, and very interesting to hear about what you were seeing from your survey results. While they were a small sample, they very much are in line with what we're hearing from network members around the world, both in terms of the work becoming harder and the caseloads going up while the funding is going down. So it's definitely something we're fighting for through all of our work as well. So I'm now going to turn to the Philippines. Another populist leader who has been controversial even before the pandemic is President Duterte. Risley, what can you tell us about the Philippine situation, especially regarding emergency powers, restrictions to fundamental freedoms, and most importantly, how are civil society groups responding to the situation? How are they doing? And please feel free to include any additional information that Amnesty International has been receiving from other countries if that's relevant as well.
Okay, thank you. I will attempt to respond to the questions by sharing what is happening here in the Philippines. I intend to share my organization and other civil society groups' stance and discussions on various political and human rights issues here in the Philippines. And also some observations from Amnesty Friends, though not necessarily an official statement of Amnesty, but yeah, since I have been in contact with them, so I would like to take this opportunity and maximize this opportunity to share what I have been hearing. Although what I am about to share are actually all over the news, but I hope this can lead to further discussions on how governments are using the global pandemic to get more powers that restrict civic space, deny people's access to information, and further promote culture of impunity. That the weaponization of the law is utilized to legitimize violation of basic civil liberties. Here in the Philippines, I would like to focus on my sharing to three things. First is the shutting down of one of the major television networks, ABS-CBN. Second, the enactment of Bayanihan to Heal as One Act, a law granting the President extraordinary powers to respond to COVID-19. And third, the fast tracking of the passage of anti-terrorism law. In December 2019, the President vowed to block the renewal of a major television network here in the Philippines, which is ABS-CBN. 5 months thereafter, or May 5, the National Telecommunications Commission of the Philippines issued a cease and desist order to the ABS-CBN News Network after its franchise expired. The NTC claimed that it was following the law, but other networks have been allowed to operate for weeks pending the renewal of their franchise. The station is a fundamental part of how Filipinos get their information, all the more vital during a pandemic. As early as January of this year, there was a clamor and pressure from the public for the Philippine government to take COVID-19 seriously. On March 25, the President responded and signed into law the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act. Bayanihan is actually a Tagalog word which means having communal or community spirit. This law granted the President 30 special powers to address concerns on COVID-19. But if I may summarize these powers, it simply means granting the President a special power to be solely in charge in addressing the pandemic, which is to undertake reasonable and necessary measures in his perspectives in combating COVID-19. Then the proposed Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 came next. This law is supposed to cure the vagueness and ambiguity of the Human Security Act. However, the Filipinos are now being presented with an even more ambiguous and vague legislative measure. The possible effect of its vagueness can result to an overreaching powers of the state, but a chilling effect on the rights of its citizens. Specifically, the provision penalizing the crime on specifically the provision penalizing the crime of inciting to commit terrorism by means of speeches, proclamations, writings, emblems, and banners can have serious repercussions to a citizen's freedom of speech and expression. The same could be weaponized to muzzle the voice of dissent and curtail constructive criticism of government acts. This is made worse by the fact that the definition of the crime of terrorism itself is very broad and could encompass certain acts which are considered as acts of activism. Penalizing membership in a terrorist organization can be freedom of association, and the gathering to this and the granting to the state of the right to detain persons for 14 days, which can be extended for another 10 days without charge, clearly runs contrary to the Constitution. What is happening here in the Philippines is not an isolated case. It seems like this has been the phenomenon across the globe because for dictators, there is no better time to have repressive policies than during a crisis. The global pandemic coronavirus has given governments convenience and opportunity to consolidate power and silence critics. Indeed, tyranny is once again awakening from its slumber. And to cite a few examples, aside from the Philippines, in Cambodia, their emergency law allows government to take any appropriate measures to fight COVID-19, including seizing property and imposing martial law. In Serbia, they have an emergency law that in effect puts the president in sole charge. In Turkey, they have decided to release around 90,000 prisoners to avoid spreading COVID-19 in jails. But political prisoners like human rights defenders, journalists, and activists pointedly excluded. This is also the case in countries like Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, and Tanzania. In Uganda, police raid a shelter housing 20 gay and transgender people. They are accused of violating social distancing rules. In Togo, their president can rule by decree. Relief money goes to those with voter ID cards, which opposition supporters lack after boycotting recent rigged elections. In Azerbaijan, their president vows to use social distancing to isolate the opposition. The Chinese government is proposing a national security law that poses a grave risk to human rights in Hong Kong. China routinely targets human rights defenders and activists under the pretext of national security. And in China, that can often mean unfair trials, secret detention, and no access to lawyers. They have also deepened and extended their surveillance state that is most developed in Xinjiang, where it was used to identify some of the 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims for detention and forced indoctrination. The governments of Thailand, Venezuela, and Bangladesh are detaining journalists, opposition activists, healthcare workers, and anyone else who dare to criticize the official response to the coronavirus. In Israel, as their prime minister faces corruption charges, they are using coronavirus to suspend operation of courts for most cases. They also cited the coronavirus to authorize its Shin Bet internal security agency to use vast amounts of location tracking data from the cell phones of ordinary Israelis. Trump administration in the US
Oh, I think.
traditional base.
Oh, Ritzley, we just lost you at the Trump administration. So if you,
Okay,
yeah, if you want to come back there.
sure. Can you hear me now clearly?
Yes, I can. Maybe it's because I'm in the
Okay.
US. Trump heard you talking about him.
Yeah, maybe. Well, as I've said, the Trump administration has used the coronavirus to discourage requests under the Freedom of Information Act, suddenly insisting they can be made by only traditional mail. In Algeria, their government has halted regular protests seeking genuine democratic reform that have been underway for more than a year. Russian government has stopped even a single person protests against Putin's plans to rip up term limits on his presidency. They are also installing one of the world's largest surveillance camera system equipped with facial recognition technology. And the list of countries that have introduced, I have so many lists more. The list goes on and on with countries having introduced and imposed repressive policies and anti-human rights systems and mechanisms during this pandemic. Autocratic governments could easily use these new tools outside of the pandemic response in the future to further entrench themselves in power and crack down on dissent. Remember, Putin grabbed extra powers after a school siege including terrorists in Beslan. Erdogan imposed a state of emergency after a failed coup in 2016. And Duterte imposed martial law in 2017 after a siege in Marawi City. Some scholars would argue that they still enjoy their emergency powers even until now. There is no question that these are extraordinary times. Even international human rights law permits restrictions on liberty in times of national emergency that are necessary and proportionate. But we should be very wary of leaders who exploit this crisis to serve their political ends. They are jeopardizing both democracy and our health. Well, here in the Philippines, human rights defenders and activists are not safe, especially during these trying times. And as far as Balaod, Mindanao is concerned, we have set up virtual legal consultations and referrals for victims of human rights violations and gender-related violence. We are documenting cases referred to us and looking for possibility of reaching out to victims even after this crisis for possible further legal assistance. Even during community quarantine or modified lockdown, we made sure that the office is open with lawyers and paralegals who are readily available to respond to legal concerns of the public, particularly of the victims and families of the victims. I will stop there, and I would welcome questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ritzley. Very depressing list, but it is very important that we're all aware just how many organizations, just adding to David's list, not even overlapping, just additional. So yes. First we've also heard from Orban, we've heard about Duterte. We're seeing a pattern here, populist authoritarian leaders. We're now going to one more in Brazil, to President Bolsonaro. Denise, we've read the news about suspensions of access to information mechanisms in Brazil, preventing protests and going to protests simultaneously. There's a recent article which quotes you talking about your organization and Article 19's call for more transparency, specifically for the release of verified COVID-19 statistics, vital to address the pandemic and really see the government's response. So I would just love to hear more from you, more about how this crisis is impacting citizens' access to information, and how right to information mechanisms and other mechanisms are working right now during the crisis. And again, how civil society groups in Brazil are responding to the challenges that are caused by the situation.
Okay, thanks for this opportunity to share with you some of what's going to happen in Brazil. I would like to give a bit of background. When Bolsonaro was elected the end of 2018, there was a distance between the second candidate from the Workers' Party, but not so big. So there is still, let's say, we started the government, Bolsonaro's government, with 40% of the population supporting progressive causes, and the model of constitutional rights and civic participation that were in place. Even after the impeachment of President Dilma in 2016, there was still councils, for example, children's rights councils, women's rights council, the health councils at municipal level, state level, and federal level. And most of these councils and civic engagement system were made with direct participation from the leaders of communities at local level, with elections, direct elections. For example, we have a national health system council which elects their civic society members from associations that were enrolled in the process. And also the National Council of Education also has civil society engagement indicating participants. What happened last year is that Bolsonaro started dismantle all the civic engagement system with more or less success, depending on the level of enforcement of the councils and the system. For example, in the case of the health system and children's rights, which is a constitutional provision that you have to consult, organizations, etc. Or in the case of education, that we also have the duty to consult, to provide consultation process for universities, for example. It was quite impossible to just dismantle the system. But where there was only kind of administrative rules and administrative procedures, things that would not need to go to the Congress, to the Parliament for changing, they just released a decree and closed it. All the levels of civic participation. In the HIV program, for example, they closed everything, which was a very strong one and with a good experience of success. In the women's rights, they closed everything. That was more about procedures and administrative procedures. And in the other cases where they should have to follow the law or send a proposal to the Congress, they sent some proposals. They lost in the Congress, and they just decided not to enforce, not providing any funds or staff for the functioning of these councils. There is the National Human Rights Council with its a three-part council with people from government, people from civil society, people from the judicial power. This council is still working at federal level, but you can imagine with lots of difficulties to make. What we can do is we still participate in the working group on freedom of expression in the case of Article 19, and we try at least to release statements and to protest. We are exercising our right to protest against what's happening in this. This was very sad because when COVID came to Brazil in February this year, the whole civic engagement system was already broke. It was very difficult, for example, to try to influence policies at all levels of the government, because when you start from the federal level, it's starting, dismantling at state level and also at municipal level, particularly due to the lack of funds. When we think, for example, the facilities for violence against women, domestic violence, they all, even if they happen at municipal level, they depend on funds from the federal level. So the whole system was just broken. And when we started this year with the pandemic, what we realized, it was very difficult to monitor government action because there was not open doors anymore, and the fact that inside the government there was some sectors still, for example, career staff, people from the Ministry of Health who are working there for 20 years, 15 years, that are not committed to Bolsonaro's government. They went to the refrigerator, what we call. So they just either they close their areas of work, or they send people on leaves, and they changed the Minister of Health 3 times. At this time, we have a military as a Minister of Health without no experience in dealing with pandemic situation. And a good part of the staff is not there anymore. The whole women's health department was closed last week because they realized that there was a specific order for legal abortion, how to deal with legal abortion. So Bolsonaro saw that there are plenty of feminists pro-abortion in my government, so I will send them out. And they just closed the department. So the people were crying in the ministry. So the staff were crying. So the crisis is that at certain, every day we ask, is it go further, or we are at the end of the tunnel? And then we see that no, we're still not there. So there are horrible things. For example, today they decided that the principals of all universities would be now nominated by him, although there is a system in place that guarantees elections of a list of 3 people to be selected from the academic community. And this has been happening every other day. So from March to now, what we see is a big health crisis, including a crisis of management, because there is no, besides no clear guidance on how to deal with the pandemic, there is also changing of staff, changing of ministers, changing of rules. And Bolsonaro himself in walking around without masks, saying, "Oh, this is a little cold, nothing is going to happen, no more than 1,000 people would die." And now I just checking the data today, it's 38,000 by today, and people who have died. And in the case of specific communities like the indigenous groups in the Amazon, the government is doing all they can to really send coronavirus for the villages. They also released an order saying that the indigenous health department from the Ministry of Health would only send funds or staff or provide some services for indigenous people who were in the villages. So they asked indigenous people living in the big cities in the Amazon region like Manaus or Belém, you have to go back to your village if you want to receive health treatment, which was a cause because people from the village said, no, you can't come because now we are a bit safe, but if you come, we will be all sick and maybe dying. And some, unfortunately, very unfortunately, indeed, some of the leaders from indigenous people's organizations have already died, like Munduruku, a famous cacique, a leader who was a professor, very important in indigenous education. He died last week. And in the case of the Amazon and indigenous, what we see is the government's like, I will use a strong word here, but like a genocide mission, you know, doing things in a very clear manner in order to make sure that these people would be kind of eliminated by the virus. Not providing any service, on the contrary, they are, you know, threatening them with the disease. And in the case of communities in the big cities, in favelas, since this guidance was very confused, you know, very contradictory, people don't know what to do, and they still have to work. And the government decided to provide a stipend of $100 for helping people in the communities to survive. So what they did is to ask people to go to the bank to get these stipends. And what we saw, it's long queues of people all together in the middle of a bank trying to get their money, this $100, in a kind of real contamination cycle of, you know, dissemination of the virus against the population. There was a possibility of doing this by you know, downloading an application in the cell phone, but then people would need a very sophisticated cell phone, which they don't. So, you know, you see that it's not only a mess, but very intentional ways of confusing people, not responding to the crisis. And in the meantime, and in parallel, they are just dismantling the legal infrastructure of the country, which allows civic participation, transparency, access to information. In the second week of March, they edited a decree saying that the law for Access to Information Act that was approved 80 years ago in Brazil would change, and they would not respond to this and this and that. So several procedures. Civil society and the Bar Association together, they started a case under the Supreme Court saying that this is a constitutional right and they cannot change this in kind of a decree or internal regulation. So we as Article 19, we participated with amicus curiae. We got the order from the Supreme Court saying that they can change the Access to Information Act, but they are not enforcing it. So what I can tell you now is every week we have to start a case under the Supreme Court in different issues, access to information, civic participation. Probably this week we would have to do this for the principles of universities on freedom of academic freedom. And there is also two cases on transparency of data, because they also started changing the data. Last Friday, they closed the website, what we call the transparency website, which was the place where the government has to show the data on COVID. So it was not possible to access the site anymore. And in a day after, on Saturday, they uploaded a new site with a different kind of information. Again, you know, a case under the Supreme Court saying that the government has to show the proper data and to have to do amicus curiae, and we got the order from the Supreme Court, and the site is there. But in the meantime, a coalition of state governors and main media started to collect themselves data and updating information. So it's a very difficult scenario, and I'm not sure about my time.
Just rounding up in the next kind of minute.
I'm just closing saying civic society is very alert. We are working a lot on issues of, and I'm just showing this slide about sharing information, sharing health, where, you know, collective of popular communicators and bloggers are starting doing the job that the government should do, which is to share information. Women's rights groups are developing new ways of supporting victims of domestic violence as well. I can finish saying we're in the middle of a battle. We don't know who is going to win, but we are very strong.
Well, that was positive, and I applaud your spirit, because maybe it's just that you're now, I don't know, Julie, you're not going to save me with a happy, positive story at the end, but oh, this is why narcissists shouldn't be presidents. So thank you, Denise, for that. And we really we have talked across the board about how more powers to government and the impositions of restrictions on people's freedoms. And one common feature that we've seen across the globe during this pandemic is, as part of these responses, is the increasing role of the security sectors. So the role the police and the military are playing in the enforcements. Again, not going well in many places. And ICJ Kenya issued a statement in April calling on the Kenyan government to respect human rights amidst the COVID pandemic and expressing concern that the country may be regressing into a police state. Julie, I would love to hear more about, how you've seen the involvement of the police and the military in enforcing government actions and how they're impacting the human rights situation. And just also hear how ICJ and other organizations are responding to these challenges. And I don't want to, I hate being the last speaker and the timekeeper, but we are going to have time for questions. But Julie, if you could try and keep to the intervention time, that would be great. Oh, no, you're still muted.
Okay. All right, so thank you very much. I think I shouldn't have gone last because mine will end on rather a sad note. So I will talk about the security sector responses during this pandemic. So my slide is on, but I'll ask the presenter to go to the third slide. So let's keep this one. Yes, so ICJ Kenya is part of the Police Reforms Working Group in Kenya and the Missing Voices Group, as well as part and parcel of the National Criminal Justice Committee. These are integral entities right now because they are all playing a part. So the Police Reforms Working Group is a group of civil society organizations that really do work around security sector reform, police advocacy. The Missing Voices Coalition is now the group of civil society organizations that are part of the Police Reform Working Group, created a platform whereby we can be putting our data and making sure that our statistics tally. So that is the figure that you can see, the picture that you can see a bit on your side. And we are part of the National Criminal Justice Committee that is a non-state and state entity brought together so that we can have discussions across the table from one another. So in this particular committee, we have the judiciary, the ODPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, you have the Inspector General of Police, and all the other state actors who otherwise would be called responsible sitting on the table. This will be important as we go on in the discourse. So ICJ Kenya sits in these three various forums, and through that has been able to do a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic. The next slide, please. So the first COVID-19, announcement was done in 12th March 2020. This was our first case. And following the case, a raft of measures have been instituted by the government. The first thing was the dusk to dawn curfew that was put in place on the 27th of March. The initial curfew was the beginning of the issues. So the curfew was declared on a Friday, and on that particular night, there was widespread human rights violations across the country. We witnessed police taking videos, talking about how they're excited to finally brutalize Kenyans, how they will be taught a lesson. And you found that in certain places, when the curfew was meant to start at 7 p.m., police were already on site and having engagements, a conflict engagement with public at around 6 p.m. So you found that the whole beginning was marred in conflict and disaster. So we came out and made a statement the following day, on the 28th of March, condemning the actions that we have seen and hoped that that would be the end of that. And hoped that now, having witnessed what had happened in various parts of the country, the police would sit down with their people, figure out a strategy, and hopefully come better prepared for the following couple of days. And unfortunately, the situation has not changed. So there has been a lockdown in various parts of the country, especially the places with the highest prevalence of cases, of COVID-19 cases. So in the coast and in certain places in Nairobi, this has, however, been lifted in the last declaration. So right now, the only thing that is in effect is a dusk to dawn curfew from 9 p.m. to 4 a.m. Now, the government issued two regulations, the Public Health Regulation, Prevention and Control of Suppression, and the Public Health Restriction of Movement of Persons and Measures. Both these regulations are the ones that actually contain people. So what did they come out and say? It's illegal to be out in public without a mask. Actually, my mask is in my bag right now. The minute I step out of the office, I have to don it. It is illegal to be out of the house past 9 p.m. now. It is illegal to really be found out and about if you're not an essential service. And ironically, the Law Society of Kenya, various human rights organizations, the Independent Policing Oversight Organization, and the human rights organizations were not gazetted as essential services. So in effect, leaving the victims to themselves during curfew hours. So that has been the situation. The picture on the side is an infographic of the situation that has occurred in Kenya since COVID-19 started. I will talk a bit about that in the next slide, but this is something that you should note. From the beginning of the curfew, we have actually seen 16 persons losing their lives because of COVID-19. And this is not as a result of the virus, this is a result of security sector deviance. So on to the next slide. So on the side, I have put the names of the victims. Something that has resonated with the US protests is that we have to say the names. We have to acknowledge these people. We have to give them presence, and we have to ensure that government never forgets that we know each and every person. So that is one of the various ways we have been engaging in and creating awareness around what is happening, putting the names out there, asking people to retweet, hashtag, go to the streets, but say those names because the names give it power. So on 27th of March, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority claimed that they had gotten 87 complaints against police officers. This is a 27th of March, which is way 2 months ago. And as at last week, on the 5th of June, we had a meeting with security sector leaders. And indeed, IPOA confirmed to us that they have had more cases reported to them towards the numbers of 300. In this period, they have confirmed that indeed there have been 15 deaths occasioned by the police, 31 incidences of serious injury, and serious in the sense that people have gone to surgery, people have lost their limbs, people have had internal bleeding and are fighting for their lives in hospital because of police excesses. There has been an outcry, a general outcry from the public around what is happening in our country, around the fact that police brutality is discriminatory to certain people. It is really perpetuated to the people who are in the informal settlements. It isn't with us, the persons who are in urban settlements, better off places, modern cities. It is in those slum areas where these instances are happening. So indeed, there's already a bias. And it is unfortunate that during this period where the poor and the vulnerable ought to be protected, you find that they are further criminalized and further brutalized. So once the conversation got traction, indeed, the security sector leaders actually called the various human rights organizations that have been shedding a light on the various plight of persons to a meeting to discuss what is going to happen. There was a public acknowledgement of the fact that there is police brutality. There are some police officers who have overstepped their mandate, and as such, there are investigations that are ongoing. The interest was further reinforced by the death of Yasin Moyo, who was a 13-year-old boy who was shot on his balcony as he watched police enforce the curfew. He was not outside, he was at home. So the shooting of Yasin Moyo really sparked a great fire within the people. And to add on that, the killing of a homeless man who had nowhere to be other than on the streets during the implementation of the curfew, further led to many people questioning what is indeed the reasoning behind the policing. Next slide, please. So yesterday, we witnessed a series of demonstrations. Now, I will say the demonstrations have been amplified by the George Floyd situation, because indeed, when the world is moving in a certain direction, you get the movement within you as well, because you currently have the same situation happening in your country. So yesterday, we witnessed a great number of human rights defenders, civil society, the public going to the streets and presenting, unfortunately, coffins to the steps of Parliament. So what you see on your side is coffins that are protest coffins placed outside Parliament, and yesterday is when they were sitting. So Parliament sits on Tuesday. So this was a very strong message. Alongside this, they delivered a petition to the member of Parliament who has mandate over certain jurisdictions that have had the highest number of police killings. So the petition was to inform him to speak at the floor of the House around what is happening in his constituency and what is happening in the country, and ensure that the voices of the people outside Parliament are heard inside Parliament. So what we have seen during the pandemic period, harassment of the poor and the vulnerable persons, securitization of the health pandemic, you find that during the implementation of the curfew, once someone is found outside the curfew, outside the house during curfew hours, there was the idea that people should be taken and detained in quarantine centers because they are considered to have been in contact with people who have the virus, which was a policy that had no bearing, really. So human rights organizations have gone to court about this. We actually sought direction from the court as to what laws are being applied in the forced quarantine measures that are being taken against people. We have seen excessive use of force. There's actual video recordings of people being beaten. Yet in Kenya, corporal punishment was abolished a long time ago. So what then informs police officers to beat people? We have seen the cases of extrajudicial killings. It is unfortunate, it is with us, it is real, and it has actually taken the death of 15 people for them to acknowledge that there is a problem. As we speak right now, there are currently 3 human rights defenders missing who have been strong advocates for against police brutality and security sector reform. So indeed, we are witnessing cases of enforced disappearances. The gender-based violence is on the rise. I think it's a situation across the world, but in Kenya, it's been amplified by the fact that people are scared to leave their homes to report. People are scared because they do not know who to report to. You don't have advocates who are working as legal essential services. So indeed, you are staying with your perpetrator in your home until the morning hours, then you can go to hospital. And the unfortunate part is, if indeed the perpetrator is someone within your family setting, then you have to go back home because there's a county lockdown. So you cannot go to your rural home. You cannot access certain parts of the country for shelter. So indeed, the situation becomes more dire. We have seen that legal aid services, we do not have a proper legal aid service. Actually, let's start there. As Kenya, we do not have a proper legal aid service that offers legal aid to the public. So civil society actors have had to step into this role and ensure that legal aid services are provided. However, we can only do so much because we don't have essential services passes. So these are some of the constraints that we are seeing. And of course, the most and overarching issue is access to justice. The courts, owing to the pandemic, have slowed their operations, meaning that people cannot really access the courts, and the courts have, what would you say? They have a certain criteria of people who they would wish to engage with them during this period. So you find that many Kenyans do not know how to even institute a suit during this period. How do you file a case? How do you approach the court? How do you get witnesses? So it's a whole lot of issues that this pandemic has then sought to highlight, which are the human rights issues that are coming out from a COVID-19 situation. The next slide, please.
Oh, okay. Is this the final slide?
Yes, this is,
Okay.
yes, 2 more. So what have we done? We have done advocacy through a series of webinars. One of the webinars is what actually you refer to. We have addressed the duty bearers in the series of webinars. We have also supported peaceful protests which abide to social distancing measures, as you can see there. This is a protest right outside the Carlton Minor mural. Carlton Minor was killed by police, and he was unarmed. We have engaged the duty bearers as to what we hope they would do, what we hope they would change. We have monitored and documented human rights violations, such as the data you have seen on the Missing Voices website. We have engaged in public interest litigation around emerging issues, the question around mandatory quarantine in a health facility, issues around access to information. And lastly, we have lent support to victims to clamor for justice. Sometimes you just need to support them to be able to get there. So we have facilitated the process for them, ensure that they get the relevant documents. Another thing that we have also done is protect our own human rights defenders, because some of them are at the grassroots level and we cannot engage with them directly, but we have put in mechanisms to ensure that they are protected from wherever they are working at. And my final slide states that what we can do during this period. I think from what we have learned, and I do believe it's a learning process for all organizations across the world, because no one had ever assumed that we would get here. But from what we have learned is that there is indeed a need for increased demand for accountability for human rights organizations with the relevant bodies. So we have been engaging IPOA, Independent Oversight Authority, in a bid for them to realize their mandate, and note that they will be called to question on whether or not they do act during this period. We have noted that there is increased need for monitoring and documentation of human rights violations. It is easier to advocate and demand for accountability when you have the documentation. So we have really emphasized on our documentation to ensure we have all the facts laid out in a proper manner so that we can present this to the various duty bearers. I've also seen the need for various persons to engage in peaceful, impactful process or advocacy. The Black Lives Matter has taught us that you can have a Blackout Tuesday, you can have various hashtags, you can take the knee. So how do we ensure that we do actually advocate for people in a way that resonates with them? Because as civil society, our ways of operation need to change during this period because we cannot meet people. So how do we ensure that our voices are heard, their voices are heard, but we ensure that we are also abiding by the safety regulations by the WHO? Collaboration between civil society organizations right now is essential. You cannot work alone, because the minute you work alone, especially in our sector, the minute you work alone, you are targeted, arrested, and detained. So the collaborative effort and the collaborative front that we have put on has ensured that we are protected from any single person who would want to arrest one individual. You cannot arrest all of us at once. Yeah. And lastly, I think the enactment of laws and policies that demand for accountability. We have noted that our country, for example, has never passed the Prevention of Torture Act, the National Coroner Service Act, and these are acts that right now would have been very essential in the documentation of these human rights violations. So what you have done is you have gone back to the drawing book to ensure that even during this period, we are advocating for those pieces of legislation to find audience before Parliament. And that is, in a nutshell, what is happening in Kenya. It sounds gloom, but we are here and we are going to protect and attempt to protect everyone and demand for accountability for the human rights violation. Thank you very much for giving me this space and this platform. I think I have stuck to 8 minutes, and I will be glad to take any and all questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. We are always short on time in these conversations, and today will be no different. But we have got a lot of questions that have come through from our audience, and I'm very keen to get as many of them out. So what I might do is raise a couple and then allow everyone a time to intervene. From Ina Morales in the Philippines, he is asking what, as a private citizen, can do to safeguard abuses against powers that we're seeing coming from the government or security services. They're seeing a lot of restrictions, as we've all heard. So what can private citizens do, which their normal playbook they can't go to? And Julie, you did start to touch on that, like how are we pivoting? What are the different ways that advocacy can happen, both as a private citizen and as civil society organizations? And if anyone has any specific tips around mobilizing while observing health guidelines, it would be great to share those. I know Vivek referenced that at the beginning. I don't know if there's any resources people have that can be shared. I'm sure BLM, Black Lives Matters must at this point. Similar question as well from Andiko Sutanaman Kayo, butchered that, sorry, in Indonesia. Specifically, and I think Denise, you might be good to this, on how Indigenous groups might be able to do advocacy. Are there any examples from Brazil, or how they've been able to stand up against the government, especially when social media campaigns isn't really something that, you know, has been something that communities have access to, not just Indigenous communities, but poorer, more vulnerable communities. So any good examples there? I'm also let me just ask that question. Yeah, I'll put that to Denise first, and then let others jump in if they would like to add to that. Denise? Oh,
My
you're
mind
not. Oh,
now.
there we go.
Indigenous groups, all the indigenous peoples groups are reacting in a very strong way. So what they are doing is in several levels. One, at local level, the organizations in the Amazon region, particularly where COVID is very severe, they started doing kind of radio programs, and it's very legal empowerment methodology and podcasts, and also WhatsApp groups in 120 different native languages. So information about COVID has been broadcasted over the Amazon through the indigenous groups in Guarani, in Kaiwa, in Yanomami, in Bawa, and then in different languages that are part of the local, in Chikuna, and they are providing information in boats which are circulating still in the rivers of the Amazon. This is very strong. This is what we call community bloggers, community popular communicators, who are people dealing with online space and radio broadcasting in a very simple way from their houses, mostly young people. They are collectives like we call the Media India, which is an indigenous media, who are made of volunteers, young people from the indigenous groups who are providing proper information to the communities. This is really important, to receive information, to have access to proper information. It's also a way to prevent themselves, but to organize themselves. The second thing is about establishing some barriers to the invasion of external people. Villages are being defining that to close themselves. They are organizing themselves, the guardians of the Amazon, to protect the community and to protect the environment. And at the national level, there is a strong advocacy campaign about indigenous people, raising extra money. So groups are receiving money from Brazilians, but also from foreigners in special funds. I'm being part of one of these initiatives to have a kind of an indigenous fund to receive money for providing facilities for health and masks, etc. And also start today a quarantine podcast. I can share with you, which is made by the National Association of Indigenous Peoples Groups, APIB, with Sonia Guajajara, which is an important leader in this. So they are very well organized, but still the situation is very dangerous for indigenous groups.
David, I wonder whether you have any learnings around effective gathering during a pandemic, and how some of the best ways that you've seen that happen, or if not, open that up to others. Oh, no, you're still muted, David. Sorry.
Do you mind if I say one thing that I forgot? There is a new generation of indigenous lawyers, the ones who, for the first time ever, ended law school, that organized a network of indigenous lawyers to follow the legal procedures and the cases under the Supreme Court. There are 18 young indigenous lawyers working together in this network, and they have been also playing an important role in following the legislation and judicial cases on indigenous. It was created in February. Very, very new.
Okay, great.
I mean, we've seen people mobilizing in the US, in the UK, and different countries across the world. And basically, what we've seen is people understanding, having a good understanding of the respective laws in their countries. So in some countries, you might be able to mobilize, but there are restrictions regarding the number, as long as you enforce social distancing rules. And so a lot of mobilizing now is being done virtually through different means, right? So we've had hundreds of organizations come together at a particular time when we have a vigil to highlight the challenges faced by human rights defenders. And so the online space is really vital at the moment for bringing people together. But one of the interesting dynamics of this pandemic and how some states are using it to advance their political interest is, if you look at a country like Malawi, that was one of the first countries in the region to impose a shutdown, and that shutdown was challenged in court because civil society felt that the government would use the shutdown to clamp down or to stop protests that have been going on since May. But even when the shutdown is in place, we see supporters of political parties and even members of the ruling party having large gatherings of people coming together. I think if people decide to mobilize and whatever strategy they use, I think we shouldn't also forget, and I see that a lot with the protests happening in the US, that we are in the midst of a pandemic, and even as civil society, and the colleague that did the introductory remarks to this webinar spoke about the importance of having masks, sanitizing, and ensuring that we adhere to these health guidelines when we go out to mobilize and to protest.
Thanks, David. I would love to hear any kind of other innovative ways or positive guidance that Stefania, Julia, Ritzley will be able to offer around how to push back. I mean, you've talked about some of it in your presentations, but whether that's protest in healthy ways, if you want to add to that, or whether there's just some really more positive examples that you would like to share, some tips that other organizations can look to learn as our kind of final intervention. So Stefania, maybe I'll start with you.
Okay. So there are many ways that we have seen in which people can express their opinion during the pandemic. One that I mentioned is going in their cars and honking. And there was another example that we really loved, and that actually it's from Brazil, that people were making a lot of noise from their apartment in protest against Bolsonaro's government. So there are many ways, but I think the key issue is, and the key learning is, that despite the pandemic, we have to remain active citizens and ask for information and demand the government and all the state institutions being accountable to citizens. And there are various ways and various country contexts in which you can do that. So what might work in one country doesn't work in the other, but I think remaining resilient and remaining keen on holding governments accountable is more important now than than before, but it's equally important every time.
Thanks so much. Julie, I'm going to go to you next. I love some of the examples you've already shared as well. Oh, can people hear me? Oh, Julie, we can't. I don't know what that means, so I'm going to go to Ritzley and we can come back to you, Julie.
Sorry, I actually was trying to say that I am muted from the admin side, so I couldn't really speak.
Okay.
All right, so I like the question that the person has posed, whether and how private citizens can engage in the process. David has alluded to one, which is congregating on the online space. Webinars are a great place to get information. Right now, most webinars are free and people can access them. So getting plugged in the conversation is important. Another thing is using the tools at your disposal. We have seen that there's a 300% uptick in social media and data during this period. A lot of the people at home have turned to their phones. So post things, put your opinion out there, because if you have a following of 1,000 people, those are 1,000 people that you have spoken to about your feelings on an issue that you think is affecting persons who don't have a voice. So post your opinions, campaign with people, get into those places that people are campaigning at, Amnesty International, ICJ Kenya, and the various institutions, Article 19, and repost them and constantly update on what is happening. Another thing is a call to respective members of parliament. Because you have a representative, the rank may be different in various countries, but most of these persons who are in leadership positions are known. Make a call to them, ask them what you're doing around this, put pressure for various members within your constituency, within your grouping, to call the members of parliament, so that even if you make a call and it's 3 minutes long and 20 people make a call, that is 1 hour time of a member of parliament knowing that every one of his constituents is upset, that he is either not doing something or he needs to do something, or else the calls will not end. So call your various leaders and demand for action. Another thing is, because many people do not know where to go, you can also donate to entities that are working around the space. So if you know of organizations that are doing what they can to alleviate the suffering of people during the COVID-19 pandemic, you can make personal donations and ensure that your small donation really does manifest in something big that is happening in the institution. Another thing you could do is lend your expertise. As a private citizen, you don't necessarily have to be an advocate. You can be an educator, you can be a health worker. So you can also lend your expertise, because you find that the networks that we form are stronger when we have all the players on the table. So if you're a nurse and you offer medical services, reach out to an institution that is working with gender-based violence, because more often than not, we do not have medical practitioners who we can reach out to. So those are some of the ways that you can plug in as a private citizen. But I think of importance is ensure that you're not silent, stand up, be heard, because there is unity in numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And Ritzley, we'll turn to you for our final remarks from the panel. Oh, Ritzley might be frozen. He looks very calm. Oh, wait, no, I think you're coming back into movement.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. I couldn't agree more to what have been shared. So I will just reiterate, let's not be silent, speak up, continue to call out government stupidity and remind their obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, and demand accountability. We can, as mentioned, we can maximize social media platforms. Second, document cases of violations. And third, which I would like to really highlight, vote wisely. Here in the Philippines, utang na loob. In our vernacular, vote wisely. Do not vote those who are had bad records of running this government very poorly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all for staying on a little late. I know that we are running out of time, and I wish I could stay on with you all for another hour because there's just so much richness in this group, and we will be sharing all of the additional questions that came through on the discussion platform so that we can continue to hear from others and feel solidarity with those working on this. As long as we're talking to each other, we're using our voices and we're not being silent. So I do invite everyone to continue to come and join in this conversation on that space. We also have the Justice for All policy brief, Justice in a Pandemic, Ensuring a Just Response and Recovery. I encourage people to have a look at that, specifically on some of the legislation that might be able to be passed, and on that very critical question I've heard coming through around financing, how this vital work can be better financed right now. So we'll put a link to that. Please, everyone, share all of those resources. We'll share the PowerPoints, we'll share some of the reports that our other panelists referenced. But really all that's left for me to do is to say thank you very, very much to our panelists, to wish you just so much gratitude for all that you're continuing to do in these horrendous times. I'm sorry we didn't have any positive stories. We were actually hoping to have someone from Korea join. There are actually good examples out there where we're seeing security forces and democracy thriving. They are limited, but they are there, and we'll look to highlight in the discussion as well, because it's important to not feel in despair. So thank you for all of your work. You guys are amazing. We will get through this. We will push back against the world's worst, and strive for better. So in solidarity with you all, and in solidarity with all those protesting for Black lives as well. So thank you, everyone.